welcome to the last session of the conference. It's been an awesome conference. I hope you guys have enjoyed it as much as I have. My only thing was I wish I could have gone to see some of the other speakers because there were some amazing things that they were doing. And actually my husband came with me, so I sent him to watch other speakers, even though he's retired, he's not in education, but he can talk the talk because he hangs out with me so much. So, he came out of Kim St. Martin's talk, and he says, "Oh, she was so good. She talked about evidence-based practices and systems." I was like, "Yep, that's what we do. You can talk it." So I have to say, this morning when I heard Dr. Dijkstra's talk, that was pretty gut-wrenching. Do you guys agree? But I kept thinking, I'm really glad that my talk is around a lot of language development, oral language, and what can we do in our classrooms to help kids develop that language, because obviously that's an important skill that needs to be built in order for kids to be successful. So we're talking about reading comprehension, much more than strategy instruction. My name's Mary Dahlgren. I'm from Oklahoma City. I've been working with the state of Ohio for the last 3 or 4 years doing some letters implementation. So it's been really fun to get to know your state, and my friend Lori over here, and get to go to her, is it a ESC? ESC and up in Mahoning County. Yes. So getting to know a lot about your schools and your state has been great. So we're going to talk a little bit about comprehension, and I start this session. I know everybody doesn't have their handouts, but all the handouts are online. But I like to start the session with just a true-false. And so thumbs up if the answer is true, thumbs down if it's false. Everybody gets to participate. And I promise not to call anybody's name or anything, point to anybody. But just in general, I'm going to ask you all to respond to this. So number one, we can predict silent passage reading comprehension in third graders fairly well using simple screening tests of speech, sound awareness, and letter knowledge in kindergarten. Is that true? Let me give you kind of some insight into this. So if I have kindergartners that know their letter names and they're phonemically aware, are they on a good path to being a reader? Yes or no? So that's yes. This is actually true. Because if I have kindergartners that don't know letter names and they're leaving kindergarten and they're not phonemically aware, their path is going to be interrupted. They're going to have a hard time getting to that third grade outcome. And that's a really important thing to think about. What's happening in each step as we're moving our students through the grade levels? And are they hitting are these predictors being met? And if not, what are we doing about that? So many children who seem behind in reading readiness at the kindergarten level are late bloomers. If we wait, they'll catch up. True or false? Pretty much majority false. You are correct. A 45-minute screening in kindergarten will be more reliable than a 10 to 15-minute screening for predicting long-term reading outcomes. 45 minutes in kindergarten, 10 to 15 minutes. Everybody's with us. False. Yeah. We have good screeners, thank goodness, too, so we don't have to torture children for 45 minutes, right, especially in kinder. Most reading problems emerge late, around the end of third grade, when children must shift from learning to read to reading to learn. Okay, again, a good majority of people saying false. You guys are with me. All right, number 5, spelling errors in written language samples can provide valuable information for teachers about a student's reading subskills. Yeah, everybody's pretty much in agreement. This idea of spelling errors in written language, it gives us good insight into their phonemic awareness skills. Do they understand the patterns of the language? And writing samples, their conceptual knowledge, and how do you put words together in the syntax of our language. So all of those things give us nice insight into what's happening with our children. All right, number 6, students can no longer benefit from word study, including syllabication, word structure, and word origin after the end of third grade. False. We know that these are good practices beyond third grade. All right, when difficulties in reading persist into middle school or high school, these students should be taught using a whole word, site-based approach to reading. Okay, lots of thumbs down. I would agree, that's false. They still need to learn how the code works, regardless of if they're in kindergarten or if you have 7th graders who can't decode, you have to teach them that. Teaching them try to memorize sight words and whole words is impossible. The use of timed assessments is important because it is both the accuracy and the fluency of reading that matter for student progress. So I don't have very many people participating. Come on, let's see. I see thumbs up and most everybody's thumbs up. We would agree with that timed assessments, because that automaticity, can they quickly recall the information that they need? We know with our dyslexic students, oftentimes it takes longer to process, and that's why having documentation to have untimed tests is important. But for our average readers, we want to be able to recall information quickly and accurately. We are going to work on some of these types of things around oral language and concepts as we move through this session. All right, specialists and outside evaluators are the only personnel who are qualified to gather assessment information on student reading progress. We all know that's not true. That was an easy one. That's false. All students below grade level in reading should be grouped together and provided with one intensive reading program. No, and we're going to talk about that as we look at the simple view of reading, what is reading, and here's my first graphic for you. Wow. When we talk about what is reading, this idea that reading is complex is absolutely true. And this is work from Frank Valentino and his associates as they were looking at reading and what goes into this outcome of reading comprehension. So our goal is reading comprehension. What are the 2 big factors that contribute to reading comprehension? Number 1, language comprehension. That's our focus for today in this session. But number 2, context-free word identification or decoding. And interestingly, all of these things lead to those 2 factors to get to our outcome of reading comprehension. Now we're going to move to the simple view of reading to talk about that, because we can see all the things that go into those 2 big sub-skills and really start to think about what happens in the reading process in these complexities of reading. But understanding language comprehension, again, what we're talking about, the ability to understand language by using semantic information to derive meaning from the individual and related multiple sentences. So as we get towards the end of the session, we are going to talk about the sentence level of comprehension. And oftentimes when we look at comprehension, we think about comprehension at the full text level or even paragraph level, but we know more and more that kids are breaking down at that sentence level. So how do I track information from one sentence to the next, tying that information together? Our kids with low language skills, our kids that have difficulty processing, our kids that have difficulty tracking that information, those are the things that we want to keep in mind. And I think that as we go through this session, and we're going to do some debriefing and talking about this, I'll be interested to hear from you what kinds of characteristics you can identify students as falling into different categories when we talk about language comprehension. So the ability to understand oral language. The other thing that's important to think about and know is that my reading comprehension level cannot exceed my listening comprehension level. So if my language comprehension is low, that's a red flag. My reading comprehension is going to be low. If my listening comprehension, so you read to me and I ask you to discuss the text with me, if I can't do that easily, my reading comprehension is going to be low. And I think that we don't put enough emphasis on listening comprehension factors, especially with little ones, but that's real insight into thinking, oh my gosh, I need to be working on this side of the equation. We know in beginning reading I have to teach the phonemic awareness and the decoding skills and get that sight word automaticity going, but at the same time, I need to build their language comprehension. So we'll work into that. Defining our terms, context-free word recognition, this is decoding, and the idea that I have efficient word recognition skills, rapid recognition of all words, whether decodable or not, and the idea that I can read words out of context, a list of words, and even, I want you guys to think about this, words, when I have a multisyllabic word, and I have a word like athlete. Okay, if I read that syllable by syllable, the first syllable in athlete is what? Ath. The second syllable is leet. So if I were to read the word syllable by syllable, ath, A-T-H, nonsense word, leet, L-E-T-E, nonsense word, and if I can't read within the syllables, I can't read longer words. So our syllables in longer words are often nonsense words. So that context-free word reading, do I know what the vowels are doing? Because it's really the vowel sounds that throw our kids off. Yeah, there are things that happen when our consonants are softened, the C and G and things like that. But knowing how do I chunk words and what are the vowel sounds, that's a really important skill in my decoding so I can get to meaning. So this context-free word reading, whether single words or multisyllabic words, can my students do that easily? A lot of our kids also that oftentimes we think, well, they're good readers. They can read sentences, they can read short text because they have good language skills. So I can compensate using my language skills, and I'm actually, my decoding skills might not be that strong, but I sound like a reader because I can figure out what the words are. That works well until about the end of second grade. Then you get to third grade, and it's that, how come we have the third, the fourth grade slump? We thought this child was a reader, and now all of a sudden I'm discovering that he or she can't actually read as well as we thought. So the context-free word recognition is an important part of assessment and making sure that they can read words in text and out of text. So finally, reading comprehension, the ability to understand written language by using semantic word meaning information to derive meaning from individual and related multiple sentences. So now we've moved from language comprehension to reading comprehension. I have to be able to decode the text. I have to read the print in front of me. So that's the idea of being able to turn print into language that we're talking about here. Major difference between language comprehension and reading comprehension. Language is oral, processed by ear. Reading comprehension is the print. And honestly, for many of our kids, it's the print that gets in the way. I have good language comprehension. I have good oral skills. I speak in complete sentences. And I seem like I should be an average reader or a good reader. But all of a sudden you put the print in front of me and things start to fall apart. So that's what we're really taking into consideration when we look at the simple view of reading. Are my students having trouble with decoding, or is it language comprehension, and which is interrupting that outcome of reading comprehension? So we say this equation, decoding times language comprehension equals reading comp. If I put 0 on either side of the equation, that multiplication sign, it X's out anything that's happening on either side. So I might have low decoding skills, but good language comp, my reading comp, still bad. What if I have 0.5 on reading, on decoding, and 0.5 on language? Anybody math? My outcome is 0.25. 0.25. So the idea that as we talk through this, you're going to see how those factors play a role here. So reading comprehension, you have to have, requires that we have both sides of the equation. Decoding and language comp must both be strong for us to have good reading comprehension. Reading comprehension can never be higher than the lower of the decoding or language comp. So again, if my decoding is 0.5 and my language comp is 1, I'm still going to have 0.5. It's not going to be higher than that one factor. If both decoding and language comp are are lower than strong, reading comp has to be lower than either of them. So 0.5 times 0.5, 0.25, even less when we're thinking about this, how this equation works. Reading comprehension isn't going to be an average of the two. They're two different components of the reading process. So Strong language comprehension, maybe I have great background knowledge, I have great vocabulary. It works well until about the 3rd grade. And then after that, I can't usually make up for that. Strong decoding skills, I've got those kids, they can read anything I put in front of them. They have no idea what they've just read. Now, we don't have a large number of kids that fit into this category, but we have more and more EL students that fit into this category, which is kind of interesting. So especially as I encounter our Spanish-speaking children, they figure out the code and they learn how to map that speech to the print. But then, as you all know, when I ask, so what was that about? I don't know. Wow, you even sounded like a reader. You had that intonation and the prosody. They learn how to mimic those things, but they still don't know what they're reading. So the language comprehension side, I don't need to work with decoding with those kids. I need to work on language comprehension. So knowing what kinds of interventions and what tools do I use for those students is important to know. So if decoding's low, reading comprehension will be hindered so much that it will be low. And if language comprehension is low, reading comprehension will be low. If both decoding and language comprehension are low, reading comprehension will be even lower. I think that's pretty easy to understand. So questions to ask about struggling readers. Whenever I sit down with a group of teachers and we're looking at student data, these are the questions that I always ask when looking at that data. Is the problem decoding? So are they phonemically aware? Do they know their letter names? Do they know the patterns in the language? Do you have a spelling inventory? Do you have a phonics inventory? How can we assess those things? Those are pretty easy to pinpoint. Is it a language comprehension problem? So I ask, does this child speak in complete sentences? Can this child answer questions in detail? Can this child join in conversations with the whole class around the material that we're discussing? Because I have plenty of kids that seem to have okay comprehension, but when I start noticing, they mumble a lot. They don't ever speak in a complete sentence. They're not sure or confident in order to answer the questions that they need to answer. That's an insight into their language comprehension. So really important questions when you're thinking about where's the breakdown occurring for these kids. And then the question might be, is the problem both? Is it both decoding and language comprehension? So here's the big question for you all. Just a minute to turn and talk at your tables. We have some nice full tables here. When it's both, what do you do? Where do you start? So just take a minute and turn and talk. When it's both sides of the equation, where do you start? Sight words. You did? Oh, you did. That's right. Right. Ooh. we talked about that because I think that that's important. So as we're talking about this, what we have good tools for measuring decoding, the decoding side of the equation. So we have things like Kilpatrick's PAST for the phonological awareness assessment. There's good phonics screeners that are available. Wiley Blevins has a good one. Most of our reading programs have a phonics assessment in them. And we have the other piece is their sight word automaticity. Can they read with fluency and understanding, but do they have that automaticity as they're reading? The language comprehension side is a little bit harder to pinpoint. So we were just talking about what can you add to your toolkit of assessments to figure out, is language comprehension there? So there are some tests that speech pathologists do, and there are tests. Who's a speech pathologist in the room? Anyone? There's the SELF, C-E-L-F, the SELF test, but there's also a test, and we were sharing that there are tests that are sentences, and you say a sentence to a student, and they simply repeat it. And the sentences get longer and longer in length. And the idea is, one, can I repeat the sentence? Because what happens with little ones, she went to the store. Lots of times little ones will say, her went to the store, so they change their pronouns. So that's insight into, are they having a difficult time making sense of the language? But when the sentences get longer and longer, learning about the chunk, holding on to information and details, can they actually repeat that? So that's one way to measure some of the language comprehension. The other way that researchers suggest that we do that is the listening comprehension. So if you have passages that are grade level passages. So if you have any listening comprehension tools, but they might be reading comprehension. Can you read a text that's at a higher level aloud to a student and ask them the questions that are in that reading passage, that go with that reading passage, and can they respond? Can they respond with incomplete thoughts? And so, again, typically, we expect students to have listening comprehension 2 to 3 years above their grade level. So for a second grader, I can usually read a third or a fourth or even a fifth grade level passage. I can read that aloud and they can answer the questions. So that's a good insight into where are their levels here and what are we working with. So some good questioning. She said, I'm on a quest to figure this out. Yes, so you're getting a clearer picture there of those things. So my question was, if it's both, where do you begin? You can't teach one over the other, right? I bet you guys said that. But here's what I know about the decoding side of the equation, is that decoding is a mastery construct, meaning once I learn to decode, I don't have to keep learning it. So we have progressions, and we have a scope and sequence of phonological awareness. We know what easier tasks are, we know what more difficult tasks are, and we know how to measure those things. We can be very precise with that. The same thing with phonics. Do they know vowel teams? Or do they know their digraphs? Can they read multisyllabic words? So I can test that. Once kids have mastered those skills, I don't have to keep teaching those things. So that's a mastery construct versus language comprehension is what we call a growth construct. Hopefully you're learning some new things, adding to your background knowledge today, yesterday as you've attended this conference, or strengthening information around certain areas as we're learning from each other. So there's that language comprehension, my vocabulary, my background knowledge, my ability to make inferences, understanding higher level language, all of that, that's constantly growing. And so being a lifelong learner, my language comprehension is always growing, but I don't have to keep learning about decoding. So for teachers working with struggling readers, first you have to teach the decoding side. Get that out of the way. For some kids, it takes longer than others. So again, I've worked for a number of years with dyslexic kids, and our decoding side is the part that's very difficult to develop, especially my phonological awareness. At the same time, am I introducing rich language, doing lots of read-alouds and introducing and teaching all sorts of wonderful conceptual knowledge? Absolutely, I'm doing that. But I can't skip over the decoding side. In a perfect world, all of our kids leave second grade knowing how to decode and read at a level that everything flips over to that now I'm reading to learn side instead of learning to read. Because we know that knowing how to decode words usually takes about 2 good years of instruction. So again, perfect world, kindergarten first, but really into second to have enough practice. But then, is anybody in here a third grade teacher? You know, if everybody came in reading on level, the world would be so much better as we're thinking about what do I need to do with my students and trying to close the gaps for those kids who are behind. But the idea of which side of the equation, because even though reading is very complex, we can start looking at both sides of this as we're thinking about reading. So I have a little decoding thing for you guys. Can anybody, answering our questions here, can you read our novel words? Lori, can you read any of those words? No. Anybody? No? These alphabets are different alphabets than we're used to, right? So one of those words is Hawaiian. That's why I asked. We're talking about Hawaii. Okay, I'm going to show you some more words. And, well, one, if you can't decode the words, you can't understand what you're reading, you know. So you'll be able to recognize some words from other languages. Anybody recognize these? What are we talking about here? Dogs. So you might recognize perro, hound, hund, canis, cane, shin. So dogs. Once I know it's about dogs, that makes it a little bit easier. But without the picture, I have no clue of even where to start. So I need to know how to decode in order to make sense of that text. Activity number 2, we're going to read a passage together chorally. So I need to practice my Anita Archer skills. We're all going to read together. When I say begin, everybody starts. Ready? Begin. The snickered. What was that about? Any idea? A snickerdaggle. Yeah, so who did the snickerdaggle outrun? The Yurthat. What did the Yurthat do? After the snickerdaggle carried on, what happened next? Do you actually know what you're talking about? No. So I can read the words. I can even answer surface level questions. But the question, can you decode the words? Yes. Why can you decode the words? Because you know the sounds to match up to the print, and you actually know what the vowel sounds are doing. You can recognize those types of things. But you're able to answer the text questions. Why is that? Why could you tell me something about the text when I asked you questions? You have a sense of syntax, and so knowing how the words work. So that's a big insight that happens actually with very young children. If anybody went to William Van Cleve's session, I think yesterday he talked about morphology. And this idea of our language and develops very young. 2, 3, 4-year-olds, they start using S on the end of words, so to recognize plural, ing, ed. That comes up in speaking. I don't know how to read those words, but I know that when I'm talking about past tense, I add that to a word. And so that happens in spoken language. You all notice, you know something about the syntax of our language, so you have insight into this. Let me ask you a question. Anybody a Spanish speaker in the room? Or teach Spanish speakers? Probably in your schools, in your classrooms. So how about if in Spanish I said the White House? How would you say that? Casa Blanca. So you'd say the house white. But in English we say the White House. So understanding syntax works in a different way in every other language. Our syntax is specific to the English language. So that's confusing. Not only as a second language learner do I have to learn about the sounds of your language, but now I have to understand the syntax that is shifted around. So having insight into the syntax is really important to my comprehension. There's these different layers that really interrupt our learning. So this was actually about the tortoise and the hare. Just so that you know that we just changed the words around, and just to make the point of what's happening here. So we just did two little things. I had you read the words that represented dog, and so when you couldn't read those words initially, was the breakdown decoding or language comprehension? It was the decoding side. When I put those words up, especially with different alphabets, you couldn't read those. So that would be a decoding issue. I couldn't get to language comprehension even because I couldn't read the words. But how about the passage with the Earthat and the Snickerdaggle? Was that language or decoding? You guys, you could decode it, and actually, you didn't read with as much prosody and intonation as the group did this morning, but you did. You did read it, and you were able to read the words in spite of the fact that they were nonsense words. But making sense of what it was about, everybody was lost. And again, which side of the equation are we struggling with when our children are breaking down? So I want you to turn to a partner, someone at your table, and you guys do need to identify partners because we'll do some activities in a little bit. But turn and talk about the breakdowns, which side of the equation they happen on, what happens in the reading process. Do you see these breakdowns with your own students? So I told you I'd give you a few minutes to process this and maybe somebody will share with the whole group about things that you're seeing with your own students that you're identifying in either the language or the decoding side, or maybe it's both. So take a minute and turn and talk, process that. So, class. Yes, yes. So, is there somebody who would share with us on some of your conversation about your students? Either side of the equation, both sides? What are you encountering? And then there was silence. Good, thank you. Yeah. So do you have some good resources?
Yes.
Good, good. Yeah, and I think that one of our challenges as we look at phonics, I have yet to find a core reading program that teaches phonics really well. Like you have to supplement, you have to frame up that phonics instruction to get to the enough instruction, the explicit instruction, and the practice that especially K1 and 2 need. And that our core reading programs, they tend to breeze over those things. So knowing what kind of instruction to provide. So yeah, you're having both sides of the equation. But again, once you teach the decoding side and they've learned that, we can move on, which is good to know. I don't have to teach them to decode forever. It's like riding a bike. Once you learn, it happens, which is awesome. Anybody else? No. Quiet afternoon. All right, I'll keep us moving. Yeah? Great.
I'm an intervention specialist, so I work with a lot of students that have significant deficits in decoding. And for my kids at least, I find that their listening comprehension is more of a strength when we're looking at explicit comprehension questions.
Right.
So we play off that a lot to try and build.
Nice. So as an interventionist, and you have kids that have some significant issues, but they do have listening comprehension as a strength. So you use that to build on when providing them instruction. Is that right? I was asked to restate things for our camera so people can hear. And you talk softly, so and then everybody else in the room can hear. So what are some of the ways that you use to support that language comprehension, or to use that language comprehension?
I do a lot of read aloud for them. A lot of them qualify for full reading access for the state test as it is. So the whole state test, even the ELA portion, is read aloud to them.
Okay.
So we really work on, we really use that to try and build the comprehension more.
Right. So she said she uses read alouds and does a lot of reading aloud and helping them, which I'm thinking, and the activities that we're getting ready to do, how do I organize my thinking? What do I pay attention to? If I have low language skills, as you said, being in a big urban district, that's often the difficulty for me is I don't know what to pay attention to, and I don't know how to hold on to the information. But fortunately, having kids that do have strong language skills, you can use that, and they have access so that you can read aloud. The ELA portion of the Ohio test is read to them, so that's to their great advantage. So good listening comprehension skills. All right. So yes.
All right. This is a really big conundrum where I'm from to Dayton.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But
How to
really
remedy that. And you, I'm sure you're not the only group in the room that has that situation. And as a third grade teacher, there's other third grade teachers in here, knowing there's every district that I work with, that issue comes up, and it's not just third grade. What do I do when I get to fifth grade? And believe me, my middle school teachers have no idea what to do. So the whole, what do I do? Well, you have to teach them to decode, because believe me, when they get to fourth grade, there's even a lesser chance that somebody's going to teach me how to decode. When I get to fifth grade, the odds go down. And when I get to middle school, who has time to teach decoding? And most of my middle school teachers don't know how to do that anyway. So I know that there's the risk of failure if you're not doing your test prep. But the whole thing of test prep, if they can't read the test, does test prep really make a difference anyway? So I think it's that idea of if we don't teach them how to read, and back to Steve Dykstra's comments this morning, right? Reading and being literate is my way out of many of the situations that I'm in life. So I think the state testing has to come secondary to what are we doing with kids' lives. You know, I don't know if that's helpful, but I think you have to have good interventions and know what are good programs to teach phonemic awareness well and to teach that phonics systematically. At the same time, you're building language skills, so which is usually through listening comprehension and read alouds. So I think having access to good phonics programs is really necessary for you to use. So I don't know if that helps you. This is, some of you all are probably familiar with Scarborough's reading rope, and as I talk about the simple view of reading and I look at the reading rope, we think about these bottom strands, again, the decoding side of the equation. So I have my phonological awareness, the decoding, and sight word recognition. And if anybody came to my workshop yesterday, I talked about sound walls and phonology a lot, building into how do I gain access to sight words rapidly and automatically so I can move into what we call the self-teaching orthographic mapping. And the idea is that I can't develop that sight word knowledge. My sight words don't grow if I don't know letter names and if I'm not phonemically aware. So again, for kindergarten teachers, if you have kindergartners that don't know letter names and they're not phonemically aware, their sight word knowledge is going to be very low. They might be able to visually memorize some sight words, but they're not going to grow that bank of sight word knowledge if phonemic awareness and letter knowledge is not in place. So that's an important part of the decoding side of the equation to get to that automaticity and reading with fluency. And then we have the language comprehension side. So really focusing on this growth construct background knowledge, having lots of facts and conceptual knowledge, my vocabulary, language structures, and understanding the syntax of language, semantics, word meanings, verbal reasoning, that ability to inference and understanding metaphoric language, all those types of things that go with that language comprehension, and then my literacy knowledge, understanding concepts of print, but understanding the structure of language and different genres. So if I have a narrative text, I know that there are going to be certain features in a narrative text, the characters, the setting, the problem, the resolution. But if I'm reading an informational text, I actually have main ideas, supporting ideas, details. I'm not going to have characters in that text. So I have to shift the way that I'm thinking about my reading, and that's really important for your students that have language comprehension issues. What do I pay attention to? Being very explicit about your instruction with them as we're talking about these pieces. So all of those things come together to get to reading comprehension. And as we're looking at this, just kind of winding this up, thinking about you have to know how to decode and know the meaning of written words. And you have to understand the language used by the authors at the word, sentence, and discourse level. So both of those things are critical to get to reading comprehension. So one of my questions I want to toss out there, as I read my description of this session, I thought, what was I thinking? An hour and a half? This is like a 2-day description that I gave you. You do have handouts that cover something that would last a good day of instruction. But fluency, what is it and why is it important? And how does it relate to comprehension? So I want you guys to, again, turn and talk for a minute. And I don't want anybody to fall asleep, so you got to turn and talk, do something a little bit. Late afternoon, it gets warm, or you're tired after lunch. What is fluency? Why is it important? How does it relate to comprehension? All right, so ladies and gentlemen, fluency. Fluency. What is it? What do you have to? What has to be in place to be fluent? What do you think of when you think of fluency? Say it again. Automatic decoding. You're automatic. You can read. You can match the speech to print instantly. Yes.
I was just saying that most of my kids, when we started, were below, most of the kids in the district were below reading grade level, and they were spending all their cognitive energy trying to decode, and they didn't have enough left for comprehension.
Right.
So we had to build fluency by whatever means, whether it's ciphers or decoding or all of the above, so that they can start to.
And truly, that's where the value of practice comes in. Like if they know the patterns and they can sound things out, but if I haven't practiced it enough for those roots to be automatic, then it's going to use up all my cognitive desk space, and it's going to interfere with my comprehension. And so you really kind of got to the question, does fluency relate to comprehension? Absolutely, it does. So I said accuracy, rate, intonation, prosody, those are all things that have to do with fluency. The alphabetic principle, so knowing phonemes, graphemes, reading multisyllabic words, all build into that. And then vocabulary and background knowledge. So my rate of reading changes depending upon my knowledge about the topic that I'm reading. And you all see this all the time with kids, but I think about if I was asked to read a passage on how geological surveys are done, my reading rate would be low. You give me something to read about the science of reading, I've got that. I have the background knowledge, I have the terminology, I understand it. But if I don't know what the word meanings are, it's slowing me down. I have to stop and process it. I have to make connections. So fluency background knowledge and vocabulary do play a role in fluency. And I actually increase those things by reading a lot. So reading rate is important. Being able to read a certain number of words per minute, but it's not the end-all, be-all. The more that I read, the more fluent I become. So, question?
If you said the student is fluent in this passage, are you assuming that they have comprehension with it?
I am assuming that they have comprehension because I don't think of fluency as just rate.
She's fluent in this. She's read this passage, this grade-level passage, and they're fluent. I can assume that they understood what they read.
Right, because yes, and I think that that's a misunderstanding of in our fluency, and actually that's a question that I have that's coming up. What's the purpose of a 1-minute assessment versus what's the purpose of reading longer passages? So why do we do 1-minute assessments? Because we often do that to assess fluency. But why do we do that? Because you can calculate the words per minute, and truly, what I was really trying to get at, and I kind of front-loaded all this, the idea that a 1-minute, the purpose of a 1-minute read is really for assessment purposes. So when 1-minute reads and all of our fluency practices and fluency norms were created, it was to determine really, do they have those decoding skills? Can they read with accuracy? But I also need other measures for comprehension. Do I ask kids what they've just read about? Yes, because what's happened is that kids think, I just read for 1 minute, I don't have to pay attention to what I read. Good readers are attending to the text. But 1-minute reads are not a good instructional practice constantly. 1-minute reads are good for assessment purposes. So the idea that I'm reading longer passages and not being timed on those, but I'm reading longer passages because I have to build stamina. I have to build background knowledge. And I need to read a variety of things to build background knowledge. So rereading the same thing over and over again isn't going to help those upper strands of the reading rope, the language comprehension side that we're talking about. Again, the more background knowledge, the more vocabulary, the more fluent I become if my decoding's in place. So those are things to kind of think about. What is the purpose of a 1-minute read? It's an assessment tool. And that's important to keep that in mind because there are other things that go into this idea of becoming fluent. So let's, I put a link in the documents that you can click on that Jan Hasbrook wrote a paper for the International Literacy Association. I think Deb Glazier and Jan Hasbrook wrote it together. Jan Hasbrook also has a podcast that she's recently done on fluency. Anybody listen to podcasts? There's the new Dibbles group is called Acadience. And Jan Hasbrook did a nice podcast with Acadience on fluency. And she talks about how in her graduate program, how she decided that she wanted to learn more about fluency. And she and Jerry Tyndall created the fluency norms that we use pretty much nowadays for everyone. And so it's really insightful. And she talks about that she wishes there wasn't so much emphasis on that. She says, I wish that we didn't have everything named oral reading fluency. Like it wasn't called a fluency because the misconception of if they're reading fast, does that mean they're a good reader? Well, no, not necessarily. If they can read about 120 words per minute on their grade level, they have a good chance of being good comprehenders. That's a predictor for reading success. I don't have to keep pushing upper limits of fluency. I need to build background knowledge. I need to build vocabulary. I need to shift my focus. And that's what Jan talks about in her podcast. So if you need something, if you have a long drive home, download the podcast. It's a good one to listen to if your brain's not dead from this session. So, all right, how do we develop this language comprehension? We need a strong oral language base to do that. So I have 3 activities that I'm going to share with you that you can take back to your classrooms right away. And the first one is a naming activity, and you're going to work with a partner to do that. And then we'll do some describing, and I'll talk a little bit about retell also. So now is when you need a partner for your naming activity. And this is all in your handouts. You can download this information. But when we do naming, you're going to choose a topic. Now, if I'm doing a read aloud, or it doesn't even matter if it's a read aloud, it's something that we're going to read about. And it might be science, it might be social studies, it could be my literacy reading, whatever it is that we're reading. But choosing that topic, working with that topic. And so I'm going to say, I'm working with young children. We're going to read about Peter Rabbit. And we're going to do an activity where we're naming different things that grow in a garden. So I'm trying to set up that understanding of what we're going to be reading about, thinking about as we're looking at this. So students name objects related to what's going to be grown in a garden. Students rapidly name objects related to topic by category. What different kinds of vegetables are there? What things are green? What's orange? What's red? So we might group it in categories like that. Ranking objects, the size. So I use the example of ranking to increase world knowledge, thinking about how things relate to one another. So for example, if I am ranking, we're reading something having to do with sports, and I ask you to name different types of balls that are used in sporting events. What are different kinds of balls that are used? Football, bowling ball, baseball, bocce ball, basketball, golf ball, ping pong balls. So what if we said let's rank those in size? A pool ball. So what's the biggest ball that you think of? A beach ball. And then I might go to a basketball, maybe a soccer ball. What's one of the smallest balls? Ping pong ball or golf ball. Those are small. So good writers, they help us. They use comparisons. So actually doing this ranking activity, it helps me to think about something when I'm reading and the writer says it was the size of a golf ball. Because that's what good writers do, because they want to give us a context to understand what they're describing. So this activity, which is relatively simple, I can name things, but now I'm going to name things having to do with size, the intensity. So if I talked about intensity of colors, different colors of blue, what's an intense color of blue, and then what's a lighter blue? What are the labels that we can put on that? Then I have word choices, and I know why authors use different words in their writing, and guess what? I can use those also. So this relationship for me becomes a reading comprehension and a written composition piece as I'm thinking about these things, but it helps me to understand the author's tone when I'm reading. I'm paying attention to those types of things. These are things that we often don't talk about, but thinking about how do I build that into my daily instruction. And I can start with kindergarten when we're doing these types of activities. Naming objects. So you guys are going to do a naming task. You need a partner, and you need a piece of paper and a pencil, because someone is going to name things. I'll give you a category, and your partner will name, and you have to tally the number of things that they say. Don't try to write down what they say, just tally, because our goal is how quickly can you name things in this category, all right? So everybody get a partner. Everybody have a partner? Yes? Yes? You guys have a partner? You have a partner? Okay. So here we go. Your first category. You know who's the namer and who's the tally, doing the tallies? Okay, first category. Name fruits and vegetables. Ready? Go. I need to get my timer out. Okay, stop. And if you were doing the tally marks, just total up how many things they said, and then you're going to switch roles. So you guys can use the same sheet of paper. Yeah, it's hard when you're so close together. No, it has to be a different one. Oh, it's a different, yes, I'm going to give you a different category. Okay, ready? So partner number 2, you are going to name animals. Ready? Begin. Okay, stop. Stop. And again. Total the tallies. You're going to get to each do it one more time. You each have one more category. Okay, so everybody tallied? So let me ask you guys this. Did you all get more than 10 in each category? Everybody get more than 10? Okay, here's your next topic. Your next topic, NBA teams. Ready? Go. Stop. All right. I hope everybody, did you all get 10? No. I heard you say, no, I don't know any. I hope you all named the Oklahoma City Thunder for my Oklahoma team, NBA team. No? All right. One more category. Ready? Switch roles one more time, and we'll tally all this together. Last category. Name presidents. All right, ready? Stop. Stop. Ah. Okay, so that was fun, right? Naming. So we're going to talk about this. We're going to debrief it. But first, I want you to total up all of your tally marks. Between the two of you, total them up and divide by 2. Your naming MBA teams probably brought your average down. But total them up and divide by 2. Yeah, total all the tallies and divide by 2. So between the two of you. Okay, so what were some of the averages that we came up with? 23.5, 22, 33, 30. Some people knew MBA teams. So I want you guys to notice, are you smarter than a 5th grader? So these were some numbers that working in schools with kids on doing these types of tasks, what they could do on the average in about 2 minutes, naming different tasks, so that ability to recall information automatically. Well, let's talk about how you did this. When you did fruits and vegetables, what did you do to help come up with fruits and vegetables? Those of you who were namers, what did you do? You walked through your grocery store. So you have, that's what we call a retrieval plan. I have a way to start thinking about that. How many other people did the grocery store? What were other things that you used? Anybody start off just naming things randomly and think, oh, I need a better way to, so what happened? And that's common. People think, I have people say, I thought about what I liked. I think about what goes into a salad, what's in my refrigerator, all the different things. And then did you start to run out and use another plan?
Well, then I started using all different types of peppers.
Okay. So you landed on a category and kind of went with that. Nice, nice. Anybody else? How did you recall that? But having a retrieval plan. Do I know how to do that? So going to the grocery store and knowing when I go to the grocery store that it's organized by categories. So thinking about how life in general is categorized. You know, we have categories about different things. When I go to the grocery store, apples and aspirin are not next to each other. You all know that. It's not in alphabetical order. So I need to understand how categories work. And the same thing happens in a conference, how things are categorized, how you find all the meeting rooms, where the hotel rooms are, noticing where a restaurant is. When I go to the airport, things are categorized. I have terminals that we go to. We have specific gates that we go to. Once I get on the airplane, I have to get into my seat. So there's different things, and the category levels go from very broad to very narrow. That's a retrieval plan, logical thinking. Do we talk to our kids about those things? Because your kids will say, I don't know. Well, how would you figure that out? Let's talk about how to go about doing that. How about if you were naming animals? What did you do? Anybody use? Yes? Nice. Farm, ocean, zoo. So you had your categories. Others did that too. I heard somebody who started with alligators and then bears. Somebody was doing the alphabet. Was that you? Yeah. So it's interesting, like thinking about how am I going to organize my thinking so that I have a retrieval pattern for coming up with these words. And again, when I'm working with kids and we do this type of task, I have everybody name. So if we're doing a naming activity, I just have everybody, it's kind of a controlled pandemonium. Everybody's blurting out, but it's okay because we only do it for about 20 seconds. But the idea being is that my high language kids, they know things and they can answer. My low language kids, they're hearing these words. And then they haven't, now I'm starting to activate some background knowledge around this category or whatever it is that we're talking about. And then I have kids that repeat what other kids have said. And you know what? That's okay. As long as I have something, an ability to respond, that I'm starting to understand, how do these retrieval patterns work? Do I even have a retrieval pattern? If you've given me insight into that, that's going to help me make sense of a lot of things in life and knowing how categories work and how life is organized in general. Your school day is organized. In the morning, you probably start with breakfast in most of your schools, and then you have maybe a morning meeting. Typically, you have a reading block or a math block. You have a certain time for specials. You have your lunch. We have categories of different things. I think about a news show. Now we have cable TV. But back in the day, we used to have 3 main channels, for those of you who are very young. Right, Lori? Yeah. We had 3 channels. So what happened if you turned on the news at 6 o'clock? What would you hear? The buzzing sound, the white sound. No, but what's the information that the news is giving you straight up at 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock? Local news. And then 6 o'clock would be the world news, right? Okay, but so 6 o'clock local news, big headlines. What happens at 6:15? Weather. What happens at 6:20? Okay, it's like, you guys, you know these things that are categorized in certain ways, but oftentimes we never talk to our kids about these things. So my insight into how things work, what if we were explicit about this and really help kids to go, oh, that's how you make these connections. That's how you figure these things out. So thinking about how am I setting this up as I'm working through naming tasks. It's easy and it's fun. And yeah, it's a little bit of pandemonium. Oh, there's my timer. Sorry. Getting kids to just retrieve information easily. So describing. Now that we've looked at, or we've come up with different things, let's develop our language a little bit further. So we're going to describe something orally, and we're going to start by, we're going to use a systematic way to describe something. So we'll name the object, put a label on it, put it in a category, and then name the functions. What's the purpose of the object that we're getting ready to name? I'll show you a picture in just a minute. Let's talk about color, size, shape, compare it to another object, use a simile or metaphor. So we started off with fruits and vegetables, so I chose cherry tomatoes. And thinking about when I'm in the grocery store, I'm always watching, what are parents and kids doing, right? So is everybody on their phone? Mom's on the phone talking, my child's on the phone playing with their whatever game they have, or is there a conversation about, look, these are cherry tomatoes, and you know why they're called cherry tomatoes? What else in the produce section goes with cherry tomatoes that might have the same name? What other categories, what other kinds of tomatoes do we have? I mean, noticing who's talking about those things. Those are your high language comprehension kids, because somebody's talking to me and they're narrating what's happening in my life and they're explaining things to me. Even if I'm not old enough to talk, I'm hearing language, and that's really important. If you've heard the 30 million word gap, you know how important language is. So thinking about how do I develop this conversation around things. Parents will say, I don't know what to say to my kids. Well, start narrating, doing a narrative of what's happening in your life. Just talk about what's happening. Name the vegetables and fruits when you walk through the grocery store. Read the different labels on the cereal boxes. Whatever it is, but make sure that you're talking to your child, and it will springboard to other things. So I'm going to give you guys a minute. I'm going to put it back on this slide. Think about your cherry tomatoes and turn and talk with your neighbor, describing. And first of all, I'm going to ask you to describe, and then I'm going to ask you to do one more thing. So use our strategy here for describing. Talk about your cherry tomatoes. You and your partner can do that. I need to turn off my timer. Okay, so someone tell me, what did you say about the size of a cherry tomato? It's the size of a golf ball. Good, so you used some of our things I mentioned earlier to talk about. Anybody else? Say it again? They were small. Okay, so what would be a good, who else made a comparison? I could say it's about the size of the tip of my thumb. So the idea of using a comparison to help me realize how small those cherry tomatoes really are. I have a friend who was a consultant working with New York City Public Schools, and she went in and tried to explain what a cow looked like, smelled like, all those good things. And later that day, somebody said to her, "So do the New York City kids actually understand what a cow is if they've never seen it?" And she's like, "Yeah, I've explained it and everything." Go back and ask them tomorrow how big a cow is. Guess what they said? Like this big. Cows are like this. Because on the picture on the screen, they look like about this size. I mean, it's like having that comparison and understanding conceptually, wow, that's a big difference in what I really thought, of being able to describe, and good writers and having good language skills in order to explain things. Language is power, but helping your kids organize their language is really important, and thinking about how can I do that. So we typically go from print to print, from the page to something written or to some kind of response, but I'm challenging you all to think about how do you develop language in your classrooms, and this is relatively easy. It's important to do with young children, but it's important to do with older kids too, because I know if my students can't say it, can they actually write about it? Not really. So if we skip the step of language, it's problematic. The other thing, I didn't realize our time was getting away from us. The other thing that I would ask was, can you create a 7-word sentence to at least start describing these cherry tomatoes? And that's one of the things that I always ask students to do when they're talking. And if you do show and tell, or whatever you call it nowadays in kindergarten, doing these things where where language is involved, everybody counting and saying, what else can you add to that sentence to make it a 7-word sentence? So our challenge is that we're speaking in 7-word sentences, but I need you to model that for me, and guess what? My writing of sentences will also be better as I'm doing that. So describing, and then I'm going to quickly talk about retelling. So as I'm reading a passage to students, the idea of using pictures, and I'm talking about when I'm doing read alouds that maybe I don't have a lot of good pictures for, but drawing pictures, using clip art, something to model what are the important points as I'm listening to the story, and the idea of drawing or displaying simple pictures that represent the important points of a passage. So I use the story of the contest of the wind and the sun. And again, I'm not going to read that whole passage to you, but the idea that they were going to have a contest to see who could blow the coats off of the people, and or how could they get the people down below to take off their coats. So the wind went first, and he blew and blew and blew, and everybody just pulled their coats more tightly around them. And then the sun came out, and the sun shone brightly and made everything very warm. And so what? Everybody began to take their coats off. So the sun won the prize. in the contest against the wind and the sun. Now, I'm going to ask my students to retell the story using these pictures as their big ideas. So knowing how do I do that retell, but I need to model it first. That's the other thing. So this is great to do during an intervention time as maybe you've read a story in whole group, but now we want to talk about this, and I'm going to lay out those pictures and talk about it as I walk my students through these things. As they get older, I can use words or phrases, so I'm going to scaffold this in different ways, but this idea of modeling what are the big ideas that I need to attend to as I'm thinking about the text and doing the retell. So we've been talking about language, but words, phrases, concepts that we're building. I want to take a few minutes to talk to you all about sentence and understanding a little bit about what we call the mental model. And I use Kate Kane's work. Kate Kane is a researcher from England, and she's done in-depth work on comprehension and vocabulary instruction. But I love this quote that reading comprehension is important not just for understanding text, but for broader learning, success in education, and employment. And again, I think this goes back to Dr. Dijkstra's comments this morning and thinking about if I can read, I have a chance at so many other things in my life. And so the mental model, the idea of what is this text about that I'm reading, and understanding how it's situated and what do I need to be thinking about as a reader. So I'm going to give you a passage and ask you to read it. When you finish reading it, just hold your thumbs up. I'm thinking most of us can't make sense of what this text is until I give you more information. All right, so just take a minute and read that. Okay, I'm going to stop you wherever you are. So somebody tell me what this was about. Making slime. What were things that you pulled from the text? It's a process. It's kind of like going back to the Yurthat and the Snickerdagel. Like, I can tell you some words, but I'm not exactly sure. So maybe making slime. That would be good because you thought there was a process that went with it. So it was hard to make sense of this, right? This was created to create that cognitive dissonance to prove the point of how, if I don't have the background knowledge, if I don't know something about it, in spite of the fact that I can read the words, I can make sense of the sentences, I can't get the big picture of what we're talking about. Well, it's about building a snowman. So you know, at least you were applying it to something. But the idea here that it's important to understand a text, that without the appropriate mental model, I can't make sense of what I'm reading. I can read all the words. I can follow sentence to sentence. I got that it was a process and even tried to apply it to making slime or something. So, but reading a title or seeing a picture of the situation after may only help a little bit. So that idea of, I need to have a mental model. I need to know, are we in the ballpark? Are we in the stadium? Like, there's different things, the way that I think about this. The same, I said this about text structure earlier. If I know if I'm reading narrative text, I at least know I should be paying attention to what's the rising action, what's the climax, what did the character have to do to resolve the situation, which is very different from the way that I approach my informational text. So having that mental model as I'm approaching things, it makes a difference in my comprehension. Now, let's talk quickly about sentence level, because I said I wanted to hit on this and thinking about sentences. When we talk about long sentences, sentences that have embedded clauses, oftentimes comprehension breaks down the structure of sentences and understanding cohesive ties. What makes sentences hang together from one to the next? So first of all, we'll start with anagrams. This is one of my favorite things to do. There's a lot of research on anagrams actually that improve comprehension. So if you guys are looking at these words, you can probably figure out right away what this sentence probably is. But your weak readers, that have poor language comprehension, they have a very difficult time with this type of thing. So we use a process. First of all, figure out what's the verb in the sentence. What's the action? What's the action? Opened. And who or what opened? The flowers opened. So right here I have my kernel sentence. This is the big idea of the sentence. And I actually asked you, what was the action? That would be a verb. And who or what did the action? That would be a noun. That would be a noun. So understanding nouns and verbs without having to say a noun is a person, place, or thing, or an idea, because we teach that in first grade, we teach it in second grade, and they get to fifth grade, the fifth grade teachers say they don't know what a noun is, right? But if I can learn to ask questions, what are the questions that a noun tells me? What questions does that answer? It's the who or the what the sentence is about. What's the action of the sentence? All right, so now I'm going to ask you to tell me more about the flowers. What kind of flowers? Magnolia. What else? Fragrant. So the fragrant magnolia flowers opened. When did they open? After the thunderstorm. So that whole phrase, again, when we talk about prosody and intonation, I learned how to group words together because that group of words carries meaning. And I want my students to start noticing those things. My different phrases answer different questions. So I could have adverbial phrases. I could have prepositional phrases. I can give my students insight into the grammar side of language while also digging into that sentence comprehension. I have another one, but I'm not going to do that one because I'm worried we're running out of time. And I want to talk just quickly about what we call cohesive ties. And again, things that cause breakdown for students. So pronoun reference, substitutions, and synonyms that good writers use in a text, and then conjunctions. So let's look at this. In the reference, the strange rabbit stopped dancing and came quite close. So the writer is not going to use strange rabbit again. What does he use? What does he say? He. And then later in the text he says, or later in that same sentence, he says his. So I need to know as a reader that the writer is actually replacing strange rabbit with the pronouns. This is, again, kids with weak language skills. They don't understand that. They think that they're talking about somebody else. How did I know the rabbit was a he? I thought that the rabbit was a girl. And now the writer's saying he, and I've completely lost what we're talking about. My comprehension is breaking down. So this idea of pointing out pronouns is really important, tying that information together for students. English language learners, pronouns can be a real problem for them. So here's a more complex activity where we have certain nouns: Mary, Sally, Grandma, cookies, kitten, and house. And actually, if we had a lot of time, I'd have you use the numbers to label each of these pronouns. But let's just look at the first two sentences, all right? Sally came over to play at Mary's house. She was so excited to visit her house because she had heard it was a beautiful place. So who's the first she? Sally. And who does her house belong to? Mary. And because she had heard it was a beautiful place. So if we kept going, you guys can see this gets really confusing for kids. Like, I've got to keep track of all these different nouns, and I have pronouns replacing those. I don't know if you guys ever point these types of things out to your students, but when you're preparing a text for comprehension purposes, this is a really important part of that text preparation. Noticing those pronouns, what are they linking to? Because when you ask kids questions like this, they're often very lost. They have no idea what it's referring back to. So just spending a little bit of time with the text before you preview it with your students and talking to them about these things, again, that's going to build your comprehension pretty rapidly, but I have to be able to attend to that text. Substitution. Good writers don't use the same words over and over again, and I'm not going to use pronouns, but I want you all to read through this text and tell me what words did the writer substitute for the word tomb? Underground chamber and grave. Yeah, so it would be really boring if the writer said the tomb remained a secret for nearly 1,600 years and until an archaeologist noticed rectangular patches of soft clay in the pyramid's floor, a telltale sign of a tomb. That doesn't sound like good academic text. Good writers use different words. Again, where does comprehension break down? I'm thinking you're talking about different things. Like now there's an underground chamber that we're going into, and I'm envisioning this maze, but I don't actually realize that's the tomb that they're still talking about. And now there's a grave, there's dead people there. Oh, I didn't even know what a tomb was, actually. And now I'm thinking we're talking about something completely different. So looking at the text and noticing what has a writer done, and again, this is reinforcing what is a good writer, what do you do? Collecting words, thinking about why is that vocabulary wall so powerful? Because I have other words that I can use, and I'm not going to use the word really, really, or very, very any longer, because I know I should choose better words. We've worked on that in our naming, our ranking. I have better words to think about and to use, and I'm noticing this is what writers do all the time. This is a big boost to comprehension, just doing these little things. Last one, conjunctions. So can you find there's two subordinating conjunctions and there's two coordinating conjunctions in the passage. So can you find those? While, after, and then we have our two coordinating conjunctions, the and that's connecting information. But while and after are our subordinating conjunctions. And I want you guys to notice something. If I'm teaching my students about sentences, I have a complex sentence here because I have an independent clause and a dependent clause. Could I move that? So the dependent clause starts with while, subordinating conjunction. Could I move that dependent clause to the beginning of the sentence? Yeah, I want students to notice those types of things, the way syntax and language works. So good writers finding these sentences, but noticing these words that make connections as we're working through this text, and understanding, so explaining the meanings of these words is more difficult because I need to understand what's their function, what do they do. And so again, we could spend lots of time talking about this. We're at the end of the day, the end of our session, but I hope it's given you some good ideas to think about text and our different levels of processing. So I'm just going to wrap up with this quote that's from my mentor, Louisa Moats, the idea, when kids who think aloud, so all this talk that we've been working on, think aloud while working, remember more, and make fewer mistakes. Students who respond motorically, who must do something as they learn, attend better to the details and meaning of a stimulus, and they are likely to remember more. So this idea of taking the time to build the language, it's really important. And you get a lot of bang for your buck. It's not something that as general ed classroom teachers that we've always done. This is really the kind of work that speech pathologists do, but we all have to learn those tricks so that we can build that comprehension for our students. So thank you all for being here and for your time, for being at the conference. And please feel free to email me. My email address is here and it's on all the handouts, so you can find me if you have questions and if you want some further information. So thank you all. Travel safely as you go back home.